This is a recording with my very good friend Cameron John Robbins, the gentleman artist. And what we're proposing to do here is going to look through a series of portraits of historical figures as painted by the great man himself. And I will give my indications of what I see in a face. We will look both at the portraits and I will put some images then of those particular individuals beside them. And we'll discuss from both our perspectives and see where the lines meet. So, Cameron, it's over to you. I'm going to start sharing the screen and we'll choose the first image.
Okay. General George Smith Patton Jr. My first introduction to him as a historical figure was the film with George C. Scott. And it's a brilliant film. And he's such an interesting, colorful character in the film. It almost made me wonder how accurate it was. He's possibly the most controversial historical figure I've painted so far. Maybe a couple exceptions, but certainly one of them. Very highly regarded as a military commander. Not terribly functional in peacetime, shall we say. He was almost like the saying they have horses for courses. It's like this was a man who was a born warrior, whether or not you believe in reincarnation as he did, whether he lived one life or many, he was certainly born to be a fighter. He was a very inspiring commander. He was a very aggressive general and very effective. He took care of his men. That's something you might miss with Patton, certainly from the film, is how well he took care of his men. Because he's so brash and outspoken and colorful language and all that, you would think that he might have treated people as disposable. By contrast, General Bradley, who was one of his contemporaries, was known as the GI General. He had a much softer kind of persona. He cycled through members of his staff rapidly, whereas Patton kept his for the long term. And so I don't want to assign too much meaning to either one, but Patton was known for loyalty to his men. He certainly accrued casualties. He didn't shy away from making those hard decisions, but he slept on the ground when his men were sleeping on the ground. He kept his staff intact for the most part. He was a lot of walking contradictions, but he's still regarded right up there with Grant and Lee and MacArthur. Patton is right up there as one of the most highly regarded American generals in our history.
Right. Let's just take a photo. This is really interesting for me. I watched the movie. I'd actually read about Patton. I'd watched a couple of documentaries about Patton, but I hadn't looked at him, certainly in terms of his face. I hadn't looked at him in any kind of detail before. So to find this image actually surprises me because I'm seeing stuff I would not have expected to see. So it's a great reminder not to make assumptions. The first thing is his nose is relatively small in the context of his face. So unlike some of the others we've seen. So when you see somebody with a smaller nose in proportion to the rest of the face, it tells you that this is somebody who is naturally a hard worker. So that follows on at least somewhat directly from what you were saying there, Cameron. So this is a man who's basically just going and getting things done because it's almost a compulsion. It's how he proves himself is by getting things done. His nose is also relatively thin. So it tells you he had a deep sensitivity to him, which is not something that you would associate with
Mm.
the historical image, shall we say, of Patton, because he came
Or
across
shall
as,
we say the popular image? Yeah.
yeah, the popular image, because he was known to be, he was an aggressive general. He obviously did strike one of his subordinates at a certain point, and he did have his run-ins with
Hmm.
like Eisenhower. So
Hmm.
um, it's and that's partly because he was actually a deeply sensitive individual, and when you see
Hmm.
eyes that are as wide open as that, this is somebody who does wear their heart on their sleeve. A very
Hmm.
very passionate man. He really cared about what he was doing. It wasn't
Hmm.
given the popular image. You would expected, or I might have expected, to see features that would indicate this is a cold-blooded character who's just out
Right.
to win the battle. But his eyes tell you that he cared very, very deeply.
Hmm.
A really, really passionate individual. And again, because he had this reputation for being brash and outspoken, I would have expected a
Hmm.
much wider mouth. But when you see a mouth that's
Hmm.
it's only about as wide as the width of his nostrils, it's like just it's
Right.
slightly
Soft
wider,
pitched.
but not much. It tells you this is a man who could keep a confidence. He didn't speak for the
Hmm.
sake of making noise. He spoke when he had something to say. And
Right.
one one other thing about, you notice there's sort of like an indentation at the corner of the mouth, particularly on the left side. That tells you that there was a very, I tend to use the word secretive, but I'll say private, a very
Hmm.
private side to the man. That there would have been very few people who really knew him well, despite the fact that he was
Hmm.
obviously very passionate and outgoing. There were very few people who really knew him well and were really in his close circle.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you're probably very, very right about that. You reminded me of a couple things, but start with that. I think you're right about that. He was certainly somebody who was extremely conscious of his public persona and used it very thoughtfully and deliberately to the point where it may have even been a kind of alter ego. I mean, he wasn't terribly careful about some of the things he said. Let's put it this way: he was very impolitic, and I think made no effort to be politic. He simply said what he thought and what he meant. Um, and something you see depicted in the film that I think is probably accurate, and we still see it to this day. The media was rather hostile towards him and were actually going out of their way to smear him or to undermine him or to attack his persona, whatever it is. Um, I think that's a component that we ought to appreciate a little bit in judging the man. That's not to say that some of the things said about him were incorrect, but that the public persona as it's been presented through the media is very likely biased and skewed. But the slapping incident, I'm glad you brought that up because I learned something about that from my own research, documentaries and things that are very relevant to the incident. One, uh, the soldier in question had malaria, was desperately sick with malaria, but Patton didn't know that. Patton also had malaria at that moment, had been, just been shaking. He was desperately sick and fatigued himself. And I can't point you to the exact quote, so I will qualify it, but I believe the soldier whom he slapped, there were actually two slapping incidents, as I understand it, but the famously depicted in the film, that soldier apparently, on learning that Patton was desperately sick with malaria at that moment, said something like, if I'd known how sick he was at the time, I never would have made a big deal out of this. But the other detail is when I was painting this portrait of Patton, I was working from a photograph, and a painting, unlike a photograph, is I describe it as a series of 100,000 decisions, and so you really intensely analyze all the details as you go through a portrait like this. And there are certain creases in his jacket, just above the belt line on his left side, that are not consistent with the folds of fabric alone and flesh underneath. There's enough of a hard-edged silhouette. I suddenly realized in the middle of the painting, son of a gun, he has a pistol tucked into his waistband underneath of his jacket in this photograph, which he was known to do, and doesn't surprise me a bit. But it was just a funny realization when I suddenly saw the imprint of the pistol. I could never unsee it after that.
I'm just going to add one other detail from here. And if you notice, his right eyebrow sits very close down over the eye. So when you see that on somebody, and it's the natural position, this is somebody where the mouth often engages before the mind.
Well, that was certainly Patton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you say, he wore his heart on his sleeve. He spoke his mind. He didn't mince words, and he didn't have much of a filter.
Yeah. Yeah, good way of describing it. Modern day equivalent, although obviously not in the military sense, but in the political field, would be Mitt Romney.
Donald Trump.
That's the eyebrows sitting down close.
Whom did you say? I'm sorry.
Mitt Romney.
Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he has that where
all right,
things can be unfiltered. Yeah.